All right, so after months of what appeared to be a relative bloody stalemate in the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, I now have a pretty massive update here for you guys, where it appears like the Ukrainian armed forces have successfully launched a pretty effective counteroffensive in the northeastern portion of the country. So we're going to get to a great breakdown here from Al Jazeera, which basically just shows on the map what it actually looks like on the ground in terms of which territories they have been able to actually take back from the Russian forces. But just to give a little bit of context in terms of like why this might be happening at a moment like this, I do think that over the last couple of weeks and maybe even months, you have seen, especially with energy prices skyrocketing across Western Europe and people struggling with a lot of the increased costs associated with that, I think you have seen some sort of a drop off in terms of support for this war, or at least people coming out and starting to question, like, how effective is the military equipment, how effective is the aid and funding that we are giving to Ukraine in terms of actually beating back the Russians. Are we just sort of getting into a years-long stalemate here where nothing really is going to be accomplished and millions of lives potentially are going to be lost or displaced as a result of this? And so I think on top of this just being an effective counter-offensive here in terms of just straight up retaking the territory and liberating a lot of these places, I also think that this was at least partially an effort by the Ukrainian armed forces, by Vladimir Zelensky, in order to sort of get a PR victory and to demonstrate to the West that, you should keep giving us these weapons, you should keep giving us these support measures, because we are actually going to be able to do something at least like productive with them, right? So I think that there was a little bit of that aspect to it. We had Zelensky, just to bolster that point here a little bit, recently went and rung the New York Stock Exchange bell and was asking for like $400 billion in foreign investment. So this looks to be like one of the strategies that he's using in order to prop up the war effort. Looks like they're probably going to be opening up a lot of their industries to privatization and basically exploitation by Western capitalists. So that's a big update there as well. Pretty, crazy, honestly, that you have a foreign head of state who's just going directly in the middle of a war to appeal to Wall Street investors. So that was kind of crazy. You also had Zelensky going to headline a U.S. defense industry conference, so making a direct appeal to the U.S. arms manufacturers who have been profiting greatly off of this ongoing war effort as well. So in terms of this just being like an offensive victory, yes, you have the territorial gains, which we're going to get into here, but I also think this was somewhat of a PR attempt here by the Zelensky government in order to try to sort of demonstrate that they had the ability to do something like this. So now let's go ahead and get into some of the details here in terms of what it looked like on the ground, and then I'm going to show you a little bit of the response from more of the far-right factions within Russian media and some bloggers who are basically getting absolutely pissed at Vladimir Putin for the failures during this war so far. So here from Al Jazeera, they say Ukraine's counteroffensive explained in maps. Ukraine says that it has recaptured 8,000 square kilometers, or 3,090 square miles of territory from Russian forces this month. So this is like basically more of a territorial gain from either side in this conflict that we have seen even over the last couple of months combined. So it was a pretty major operation that they were going forward with here. They say during the past week, Ukraine has inflicted a major operational blow against the Russian military, recapturing a swath of territory in eastern Ukraine, including the city of Izium, in its most significant military success since the Battle of Kyiv in March. And according to the Institute for the Study of War, they say in a first since the war began, Russia has acknowledged its defeat in the region. And they say that Ukraine's counteroffensive, which began on September 6th, took the Kremlin by surprise, both in terms of the speed and the dynamism of advances, with large pockets in Kharkiv Oblast being reclaimed. They say according to the British Defense Ministry, in recent days, Ukrainian forces have captured territory at least twice the size of London. So again, not just like marginal gains here. This was a pretty big territory swap here. They say that Ukrainian fighters were able to take advantage of a weaker presence of Russian forces in eastern Ukraine, following the redeployment of Russian fighters to Donetsk and the southern axis, where a Ukrainian offensive in Kherson presented a threat. So basically you had sort of a door opening here, or a window opening here, especially as we are starting to get more into the winter months, where you are probably going to, in all likelihood, see more of a stalemate take place, because it's just logistically harder to move around troops and equipment and vehicles, etc. And they basically saw a window here where the Russian troops were looking pretty spread thin, and you have a short window of time here to act on such a large operation like this, and they just took it, and it ended up being pretty wildly successful. But They say that the map below shows the area recaptured by Ukraine since just September 6th. So we're talking about literally just in the last week. And they say Ukraine's counteroffensive. Ukrainian forces have consolidated gains in the eastern Kharkiv region after regaining territory over the past few days. And in a first since the war began, as again, they pointed out above, Russia has acknowledged its defeat in the region. So basically they had them running all the way back from this initial line, which was just, again, from September 6th, just about over a week ago at this point. And now they have successfully captured this entire blue area here, which it even makes it that much more impressive that this territory that you're talking about here is directly on the Russian border. Like this right here, this line that's going over here is the Russian border. So not only did you like retake territory within your own country, but you also managed to push them back directly up to the actual Russian border. So that in and of itself is pretty wild to see take place this deep into the war, where it again appeared like we were seeing a pretty significant stalemate. But they have another map down here that says who controls what in Ukraine. Just to give a little bit of a broader perspective here, they say Ukraine's counteroffensive continues on the eastern and southern axis, with reports that Kyiv's troops are likely continuing ground attacks in the northern Donetsk region, which is just this region right here, and limited ground attacks across the Oskil River in Kharkiv and ground maneuvers in Kherson. So it appears like they're still going to be pushing forward with somewhat of a counteroffensive down here, mostly around the Kherson region, sort of bordering up here by the Crimean Peninsula, and continuing to push back in this eastern portion, which is where most of the fighting was taking place already since 2014, even before this most recent invasion by Russia took place. But again, I mean, look at the placement here of this Kharkiv region, which they just expelled the Russian troops from. I mean, again, you're bordering right up until Russia at this point. And keep this in mind with the total context of the war and the initial goals of what Vladimir Putin was trying to do. He was trying to take over the entirety of this country. There was one point where you basically had Russian troops who were like parked outside of Kyiv directly, and there was a window of time there, a couple of days, where we were seriously thinking that, the Zelensky government maybe should get the fuck out of the country because, there was no chance that they were going to be able to withstand the Russian onslaught. But now we're in a position where not only has Kyiv been, liberated or is standing on its own now, but I mean, they've managed to push all the way back up until the Russian border. So it has just been a complete, utter collapse of every single strategy that Vladimir Putin has been trying to put in place so far. But one more map down here, and then we'll leave this article where it ends. They say Southern Axis counteroffensive. Ukraine's counteroffensive in the Southern Axis near Kherson has continued simultaneously with one in Kharkiv. And in the past week, Ukrainian forces have targeted Russian lines of communication, ammunition depots, and military and transportation assets. So this is looking like where sort of a majority of the fighting is going to be taking place down here on this southern axis, as well as again in the eastern portion near the Donetsk region right here. So it'll be interesting to see where those types of counteroffensives end up going from here, and if they're as successful as this recent one that just took place in the northeastern portion of the country. But now I want to get into the actual responses that we have gotten within Russia, with some of their pundits, some of their bloggers, some of their media figures coming out and basically starting to turn a little bit on Vladimir Putin, or at least being more vocally critical of Putin than we have seen so far throughout the war. So they say here from The Guardian, we have already lost. Far-right Russian bloggers slam military failures. So we got a quote here from one blogger who says, the war in Ukraine will continue until the complete defeat of Russia, said Igor Gherkin, a far-right nationalist, grumbled in a video addressed to his 430,000 followers on Telegram on Monday. He said, we have already lost. The rest is just a matter of time. So keep in mind, this is not somebody who's coming at this with a leftist critique. This is somebody who is arguably to the right of Putin, and similar to a lot of other far-right bloggers and media figures within Russia, and politicians as well. A lot of these people are basically taking these failures that we have seen over the last couple of weeks and months, and basically using this as an opportunity to try to push Vladimir Putin to do even more, and maybe even go up until launching a full-scale mobilization. Because remember, so far he's still been trying to treat this as sort of a military operation or a smaller scale thing, and hasn't done a general mobilization of the Russian people to bring more people into the fight and actually have a lot more resources to wage this war, basically because he didn't want to admit that it was a full-scale war, and that they're kind of getting clapped on multiple different angles throughout this. But They continue saying that Gherkin, a former Russian intelligence colonel who became a commander of the pro-Russian separatist forces in 2014, is arguably the most prominent voice within an increasingly loud and angry group of ultra-nationalist and pro-war bloggers who have taken to berating the Kremlin for its failure to achieve its tactical objectives as the fighting in Ukraine has entered its seventh month. And they say after Ukraine's latest counteroffensive in the south and the northeast of the country, these bloggers, who have so far been granted a public platform denied to many, have intensified their criticism of the Kremlin, slamming the army's inadequate performance in the war and urging Vladimir Putin to declare a full-scale mobilization. Now, if he actually decided to do this, which it looks like right now Putin is kind of being backed into a corner to some degree, because obviously you're getting clapped on multiple different fronts here, especially with this recent successful counter offensive by the Ukrainian armed forces. And so he's basically going to be put in a situation where he either has to push for diplomatic talks, which would be, obviously far superior of an outcome, or probably the more likely outcome would be him just declaring a full-scale mobilization, which again then kind of opens the door for a lot of other risks associated for Putin, or from Putin's perspective, because then you're not able to sort of keep this war relatively quiet within your domestic population, and you would be sort of roping in the entirety of the Russian population and just kind of hoping that they stand with you throughout the rest of this war, assuming that he did some sort of a full-scale mobilization. So that would be a significant escalation, obviously on the war front, but also could open the door for significantly more pushback against Vladimir Putin from within Russia itself. But they continue here with another quote saying that they are certainly getting angrier, and with good and obvious reason, especially as the gap between the official line and the reality on the ground widens, said Mark Galeotti, an expert in Russian security affairs. And they say on Wednesday, Ukraine launched this surprise counterattack near the country's second biggest city of Kharkiv, encircling Balaklia, a strategically important town of 27,000 people, and recapturing several smaller settlements. And they say the Russian government has not published its own losses since the 25th of March, months ago, when it gave a total of 1,300 killed and 3,800 wounded. That is a significant underestimate, even if you want to sort of like bridge the gap between what Russia is claiming and what the West is claiming. This is definitely an underestimate in terms of the casualties on the Russian side. On the flip side of that, you have Western intelligence, who believes as many as 80,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded since the start of the war. So again, this is coming from Western sources. This is coming from Putin himself. Obviously, they all have their own various biases that we should take into account. But I mean, even if it's like half of this number of 80,000, I mean, that's like basically what, more than we lost in the entirety of the Afghanistan war from the American perspective. So we're talking about like mass casualties on the side of the Russian invasion here. So obviously this is something that the bodies are starting to pile up, and he can't just continue this stalemate forever and just continue losing this many people. You kind of got to have an inflection point here where he's going to have to make a decision one way or another in terms of whether or not he wants to scale back the war or he wants to escalate the war. But they continue saying that instead, since the onset of the war, the Russian Defense Ministry has repeatedly issued improbable statements about its successes on the battlefield, boasting of having destroyed more than 40 Western-made HIMARS rocket launchers and claiming to have decimated the Ukrainian Air Force. And they say state television, the most popular source of information in Russia, similarly continues to paint a rosy picture of Russian successes in Ukraine. And in a combative speech on Wednesday, Putin reiterated that Russia had lost nothing in a war that he said was going according to plan. Okay, so, Putin coming out here still to this day saying everything is going according to plan. Come on, my guy. Your plan initially, as you basically openly said to the world, or at least who we, after we got those quotes from back channels as well, your plan was to invade the entirety of Ukraine and to depose the government within Kyiv within just a matter of days. Okay, so you're now in month 7 into this war, and you're claiming that everything has gone according to plan, even after they just launched a wildly successful counter-offensive operation and retook huge swaths of territory up until your own border in Russia. I mean, like, the idea that everything is going to plan, unless Vladimir Putin is like the most intelligent 5D chess master in the history of humanity, then that's obviously bullshit. And I'm, obviously going to err on the side that it's complete bullshit. But this also ties into this other clip here that I saw the other day. Now, granted, this is coming from Julia Davis, who apparently, I guess, works for the Daily Beast. I am not in a position to determine whether or not this is a reputable translation within this video. I don't speak Russian, so I honestly have no idea, but I'll link this down below if you want to go watch through the entirety of it. It was actually really interesting, assuming that this is an accurate translation, because you basically had this like full-on debate here that was taking place within different members of the media or political sphere within Russia, and some of these people were basically saying that the war has been a complete complete failure, that the idea that like Russian troops were going to go in there and be welcomed as liberators by the Ukrainians was complete bullshit, and that a lot of these lies that were used at the outset of this war by Vladimir Putin are kind of just being exposed right now, and it's starting to catch up to him a little bit. So you had some people on this panel, like this guy, I believe, who was basically saying like, you kind of need to push for negotiations, some sort of a diplomatic settlement. This war is not going to do anything positive, regardless of what you try to do from this point, regardless of how much brutality that you want to step up in the meantime. But then you also had other motherfuckers on this panel who were basically pushing for like a full-scale mobilization and to significantly escalate the brutality and escalate the amount of troops and resources that you're dedicating to this war. So there's kind of like an interesting inter-battle happening right now within Russia between like ultra-nationalists on the far right and other right-wing people as well, who are just slightly less in favor of the war as it has been taking place so far. So, I mean, this is the current state of the war in Ukraine. I mean, obviously, you know, counter to what Vladimir Putin wants people to believe, clearly this war is not going according to plan, or even anything remotely according to his initial plan. You've completely failed to, you know, rally the world around supporting this war. You are now having sanctions that are obliterating not just your economy in many ways, but also other economies around the world in the West, specifically centering around the energy markets. But on top of that, I mean, you've suffered at least tens and tens of thousands of casualties within your troop forces, and you're basically in a position now where you either have to double down on this war and do a full-scale mobilization, and then risk the fact that the Russian population could turn against you internally, or that there could be some other factions within Russia that could turn against you as well. And the other option is that you have to go to the table and actually try to reach some sort of a diplomatic settlement, which it doesn't really appear like either the West, the Western countries like the United States, the UK, Germany, etc., nor Russia, nor the government of Ukraine under Zelensky are actually interested in doing at this time. So, I mean, there's your update on the current state of the war. You know, obviously a massive dub there from the perspective of the Ukrainian forces, and from this point on, you know, hopefully this leads to some sort of a you know, a trajectory towards diplomacy and trying to get some sort of a settlement done, because if this continues, and especially if Putin decides to ramp up his war efforts, then we're just going to continue seeing this endless bloodshed, and it's not going to be good for anybody. It's not going to be good for the Russian people, it's not going to be good for the West, and it's definitely not going to be good for the innocent people who are dying right now across the country of Ukraine.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying